Grandma and Grandpa Productions present the reading of The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 1, The Gnome King Becomes Angry. The Gnome King was... Sorry about that. The Gnome King was in an angry mood, and at such times he was very disagreeable. Everyone kept away from him, even his chief steward, Calico. Therefore, the king stormed and raved all by himself, walking up and down in his jewel-studded cavern and getting angrier all the time. Then he remembered that it was no fun being angry unless he had someone to frighten and make miserable, and he rushed to his big gong and made it clatter as loud as he could. Gong, 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 gong. In came the chief steward, trying not to show the Gnome King how frightened he was. "Send the chief counselor here," shouted the angry monarch. Calico ran out as fast as his spindly legs could carry his fat round body, and soon the chief counselor entered the cavern. The king scowled and said to him, "I'm in great trouble over the loss of my magic belt. Every little while I want to do something magical and find I can't because the belt is gone. That makes me angry, and when I'm angry, I can't have a good time. Now what do you advise?" "Some people," said the chief counselor, "enjoy getting angry, but not all the time. To be angry once in a while is really good fun, because it makes others so miserable. But to be angry morning, noon, and night, as I am, grows monotonous and prevents my gaining any other pleasure in life. Now, what do you advise?" "Well, if you are angry because you want to do magical things and can't, and if you don't want to get angry at all, my advice is to not want to do magical things." Hearing this, the king glared at his counselor with a furious expression and tugged at his own long white whiskers until he pulled them so hard that he yelped with pain. "Ouch! You are a fool!" "I share that honor with your majesty." The king roared with rage and stamped his foot. "Ho there, my guards!" Ho was a royal way of saying, "Come here." So when the guards were hoed, the king said to them, "Take this chief counselor and throw him away." Then the guards took the chief counselor and bound him with chains to prevent his struggling, and they threw him away. And the king paced up and down his cavern more angry than ever. Finally, he rushed to his big gong and made it clatter like a fire alarm. "Wah, wah, 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 wah." Calico appeared again, trembling and white with fear. "Fetch my pipe." "Yeah, your pipe is already here, your majesty." "Then get my tobacco." "The tobacco is in your pipe, your majesty." "Then bring a live coal from the furnace." "The tobacco is lighted, and your majesty is already smoking your pipe." "Why, so I am," because the king had already forgotten this fact. "But you are very rude to remind me of it." "I am a low-born, miserable villain." The Gnome King could think of nothing to say next, so he puffed away at his pipe and paced up and down the room. Finally, he remembered how angry he was and cried out, "What do you mean, Calico, by being so contented when your monarch is unhappy?" "What makes you unhappy?" "I've lost my magic belt. A little girl named Dorothy, who was here with Ozma of Oz, stole my belt and carried it away with her." And the king was so angry he was grinding his teeth with rage. She captured it in a fair fight." "But I want it. I must have it. Half my power is gone with that belt." "You will have to go to the land of Oz to recover it, and your majesty can't get to the land of Oz in any possible way. said the steward, yawning because he had been on duty 96 hours and was a little bit sleepy. Why not? Because there is a deadly desert all around that fairy country, which no one is able to cross. You know that fact as well as I do, Your Majesty. Never mind the lost belt. You have plenty of power left, for you rule this underground kingdom like a tyrant, and thousands of your gnomes obey your commands. I advise you to drink a glass of melted silver to quiet your nerves and then go to bed. The king grabbed a big ruby and threw it at Calico's head. The steward ducked just in time to escape the heavy jewel, which crashed against the door just over his left ear. Get out of my sight! Vanish! Go away! And send General Blug here! Calico hastily withdrew, and the Gnome King stamped up and down until a general of his armies appeared. This gnome, spelled N-O-M-E, this gnome was far and wide, This gnome was known far and wide as a terrible fighter and a cruel, desperate commander. He had 50,000 gnome soldiers, all well-drilled, who feared nothing but their stern master. Yet General Blug was a trifle uneasy when he arrived and saw how angry the Gnome King was. Ha! So you're here! So I am. March your army at once to the land of Oz, capture and destroy the Emerald City, and bring back to me my magic belt. You're crazy. What's that? What's that? What's that? And the Gnome King danced around on his pointed toes and was so enraged. You don't know what you're talking about. No, wrong accent. You don't know what you're talking about, continued the general, seating himself upon a large cut diamond. I advise you to stand in a corner and count 60 before you speak again. By that time, you may be more sensible. The king looked around for something to throw at General Blug, but as nothing was handy, he began to consider that perhaps the man was right, and he had been talking foolishly. So he merely threw himself into his glittering throne and tipped his crown over his head and curled his feet up under him and glared wickedly.
In the first place, we cannot march across the deadly desert to the land of Oz. And if we could, the ruler of that country, Princess Ozma, has certain fairy powers that would render my army helpless. Had you not lost your magic belt, we might have some chance of defeating Ozma, but the belt is gone. I want it! I must have it! Well then, let us try in a sensible way to get it. The belt was captured by a little girl named Dorothy, who lives in Kansas in the United States of America. But she left it in the Emerald City with Ozma. How do you know that? One of my spies, who was a blackbird, flew over the desert to the land of Oz and saw the magic belt in Ozma's palace. That gives me an idea. There are two ways to get to the land of Oz without traveling across the sandy desert. What are they? One way is over the desert, through the air, and the other way is under the desert, through the earth. Hearing this, the Gnome King uttered a yell of joy and leaped from his throne to resume his wild walk up and down the cavern. That's it, Blug. That's the idea, General. I'm king of the underworld, and my subjects are all miners. I'll make a secret tunnel under the desert to the land of Oz. Yes, right up to the Emerald City. And you will march your armies there and capture the whole country. Softly, softly, Your Majesty. Don't go too fast. My gnomes are good fighters, but they are not strong enough to conquer the Emerald City. Are you sure? Absolutely certain, Your Majesty. Then what am I to do? Give up the idea and mind your own business. You have plenty to do trying to rule your underground kingdom, but I want that magic belt, and I'm going to have it. I'd like to see you get it, replied the general, laughing maliciously. The king was by this time so exasperated that he picked up his scepter, which had a heavy ball made from a sapphire, at the end of it and threw it with all his force at General Blug. The sapphire hit the general upon his forehead and knocked him flat upon the ground, where he lay motionless. Then the king rang his gong and told his guards to drag out the general and throw him away, which they did. This gnome king was named Roquat the Red, and no one loved him. He was a bad man and a powerful monarch, and he had resolved to destroy the land of Oz and its magnificent Emerald City, to enslave Princess Ozma and little Dorothy and all the Oz people and recover his magic belt. This same belt had once enabled Roquat the Red to carry out many wicked plans, but that was before Ozma and her people marched to the underground cavern and captured it. The Gnome King could not forgive Dorothy or Princess Ozma, and he had determined to be revenged upon them. But they, for their part, did not know they had such a dangerous enemy. Indeed, Ozma and Dorothy had both almost forgotten that such a person as the Gnome King yet lived under the mountain in the land of Ev, which lay just across the deadly desert to the south of the land of Oz. An unsuspected enemy is doubly dangerous.
Chapter 2, How Uncle Henry Got into Trouble. Dorothy Gale lived on a farm in Kansas with her Aunt Em and her Uncle Henry. It was not a big farm, nor a very good one, because sometimes the rain did not come when the crops needed it, and then everything withered and dried up. Once a cyclone had carried away Uncle Henry's house, so he was obliged to build another. And as he was a poor man, he had to mortgage his farm to get the money to pay for the new house. Then his health became bad and he was too feeble to work. The doctor ordered him to take a sea voyage, and he went to Australia and took Dorothy with him. That cost a lot of money too. Uncle Henry grew poorer every year, and the crops raised on the farm only brought food for the family. Therefore the mortgage could not be paid. At last the banker who had loaned him the money said that if he did not pay on a certain day, his farm would be taken away from him. This worried Uncle Henry a great deal, for without the farm he would have no way to earn a living. He was a good man and worked in the fields as hard as he could, and Aunt Em did all the housework with Dorothy's help. Yet they did not seem to get along. This little girl Dorothy was like dozens of little girls you know. She was loving and usually sweet-tempered and had a round rosy face and earnest eyes. Life was a serious thing to Dorothy, and a wonderful thing too, for she had encountered more strange adventures in her short life than many other girls of her age. Aunt Em once had said she thought the fairies must have marked Dorothy at her birth, because she had wandered into strange places and had always been protected by some unseen power. As for Uncle Henry, he thought his little niece merely a dreamer, as her dead mother had been, for he could not quite believe all the curious stories Dorothy told them of the land of Oz, which she had visited several times. He did not think that she tried to deceive her uncle and aunt, but he imagined that she had dreamed all of these astonishing adventures, and that the dreams had been so real to her that she had come to believe them true. Whatever the explanation might be, it was certain that Dorothy had been absent from her Kansas home for several long periods, always disappearing unexpectedly, yet always coming back safe and sound, with amazing tales of where she had been and the unusual people she had met. Her uncle and aunt listened to her stories eagerly, and in spite of their doubts began to feel that the little girl had gained a lot of experience and wisdom that were unaccountable in this age when fairies are supposed to no longer exist. Most of Dorothy's stories were about the land of Oz with its beautiful Emerald City and a lovely girl ruler named Ozma, who was the most faithful friend of the little Kansas girl. When Dorothy told about the riches of this fairy country, Uncle Henry would sigh, for he knew that a single one of the great emeralds that were so common there would pay all his debts and leave his farm free. But Dorothy never brought any jewels home with her, so their poverty became greater every year. When the banker told Uncle Henry that he must pay the money in 30 days or leave the farm, The poor man was in despair, as he knew he could not possibly get the money. So he told his wife, Aunt Elm, of his trouble, and she first cried a little, and then said they must be brave and do the best they could, and go away somewhere and try to earn an honest living. But they were getting old and feeble, and she feared that they could not take care of Dorothy as well as they had formerly done. Probably the little girl would also be obliged to go to work. They did not tell their niece the sad news for several days, not wishing to make her unhappy. But one morning the little girl found Aunt Em softly crying while Uncle Henry tried to comfort her. Then Dorothy asked them to tell her what was the matter. "We must give up the farm, my dear, and wander away into the world to work for our living." The girl listened quite seriously, for she had not known how desperately poor they were.
"We don't mind for ourselves,"
said her aunt, stroking the little girl's head tenderly.
"but we love you as if you were our own child, and we are heartbroken to think that you must also endure poverty and work for a living before you have grown big and strong." "What could I do to earn money?" "You might do housework for someone, dear. You are so handy. Or perhaps you could be a nursemaid to little children. Oh, I'm sure I don't know exactly what you can do to earn money, but if your uncle and I are able to support you, we will do it willingly and send you to school. We fear, though, that we shall have much trouble in earning a living for ourselves. No one wants to employ old people who are broken down in health as we are."
Dorothy smiled.
"Wouldn't it be funny for me to do housework in Kansas when I'm a princess in the land of Oz?"
"Ah, princess?"
"Yes. Ozma made me a princess some time ago, and she has often begged me to come and live always in the Emerald City."
Her uncle and aunt looked at each other in amazement. "Do you suppose you could manage to return to your fairyland, my dear?"
"Oh, yes, I could do that easily." "How?" "Ozma sees me every day at 4 o'clock in her magic picture. She can see me wherever I am, no matter what I'm doing. And at that time, if I make a certain secret sign, she will send for me by means of the magic belt, which I once captured from the Gnome King. Then, in the wink of an eye, I shall be with Ozma in her palace."
The elder people remained silent for some time after Dorothy had spoke. Finally, Aunt Elm said with another sigh of regret,
"Oh, if that's the case, Dorothy, perhaps you'd better go live in the Emerald City. It will break our hearts to lose you from our lives, but you will be so much better off with your fairy friends that it seems wisest and best for you to go."
"I'm not so sure about that," replied Uncle Henry, shaking his gray head doubtfully. "All these things all seem real to Dorothy, I know, but I'm afraid our little girl won't find her fairyland just what she had dreamed it to be. It would make me very unhappy to think that she was wandering among strangers who might be unkind to her." Dorothy laughed merrily at this speech, and then she became sober again, for she could see how all this trouble was worrying her aunt and uncle, and knew that unless she found a way to help them, their future lives would be quite miserable and unhappy. She knew that she could help them. She had thought of a way already, yet she did not tell them at once what it was, because she must ask Ozma's consent before she was able to carry out her plans. So she said,
"If you will promise not to worry a bit about me, I'll go to the land of Oz this very afternoon, and I'll make a promise, too, that you shall both see me again before the day comes when you must leave this farm."
"The day isn't far away now. I did not tell you of our trouble until I was obliged to, dear Dorothy, so the evil time is near at hand. But if you're quite sure your fairy friends will give you a home, it would be best for you to go to them, as your aunt says. That was why Dorothy went to her little room in the attic that afternoon, taking with her a small dog named Toto. The dog had curly black hair and big brown eyes and loved Dorothy very dearly. The child had kissed her aunt and uncle affectionately before she went upstairs, and now she looked around her little room rather wistfully, gazing at the simple trinkets and worn calico and gingham dresses as if they were old friends. She was tempted at first to make a bundle of them, yet she knew very well that they would be of no use to her in her future life. She sat down upon a broken-backed chair, the only one the room contained, and holding Toto in her arms, waited patiently until the clock struck 4. Then she made the secret signal that had been agreed upon between her and Ozma. Uncle Henry and Aunt Elm waited downstairs. They were uneasy and a good deal excited, for this is a practical humdrum world, and it seemed to them quite impossible that their little niece could vanish from her home and travel instantly to Fairyland. So they watched the stairs, which seemed to be the only way Dorothy could get out of the farmhouse, and they watched them a long time. They heard the clock strike 4, but there was no sound from above. 4:30 came, and now they were too impatient to wait any longer. Softly they crept up the stairs to the door of the little girl's room.
Dorothy!
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 There was no answer. They opened the door and looked in. The room was empty. For some time Ozma had ruled over this fair country, and never was ruler more popular or beloved. She is said to be the most beautiful girl the world has ever known, and her heart and mind are as lovely as her person. Dorothy Gale had several times visited the Emerald City and experienced adventures in the Land of Oz, so that she and Ozma had become firm friends. The girl ruler had even made Dorothy a princess of Oz, and had often implored her to come to Ozma's stately palace and live there always. But Dorothy had been loyal to her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, who had cared for her since she was a baby, and she had refused to leave them because she knew they would be lonely without her. However, Dorothy now realized that things were going to be different with her uncle and her aunt from this time forward. So after putting the matter in thought, she decided to ask Ozma to grant her one great favor. A few seconds after she had made the secret signal in her little bedchamber, the Kansas girl was seated in a lovely room in Ozma's palace in the Emerald City of Oz. When the first loving kisses and embraces had been exchanged, the fair ruler inquired,
"What is the matter, dear? I know something unpleasant has happened to you, for your face was very sober when I saw it in my magic picture. And whenever you signal me to transport you to this safe place, where you are always welcome, I know you are in danger or in trouble. This time, Ozma, it isn't I, but it's worse, I guess, for Uncle Henry and Aunt Em are in a big heap of trouble, and there seems no way to get them out of it. Anyhow, not while they live in Kansas." "Tell me about it, Dorothy."
Why, you see, Uncle Henry is poor, for the farm in Kansas doesn't much as farms go. So one day Uncle Henry borrowed some money and wrote a letter saying that if he didn't pay the money back, they could take his farm in pay. Of course, he expected to pay by making money from the farm, but he just couldn't. And so they're going to take the farm, and Uncle Henry and Aunt Em won't have any place to live. They're pretty old to do much hard work, Ozma, and I'll have to work for them unless...
Ozma has been thoughtful during the story, but now she smiled and pressed her little friend's hand.
"Unless what, dear?"
Dorothy hesitated because her request meant so much to them all.
Well, I'd like to live here in the Land of Oz, where you've often invited me to live. But I can't, you know, unless Uncle Henry and Aunt Em could live here too.
"Of course not." "So in order to get you, little friend, we must invite your uncle and aunt to live in Oz also."
Oh, will you, Ozma? Oh, will you?
Will you bring them here with the magic belt and give them a nice little farm in the Munchkin country or in Winky country or some other place? To be sure.
Full of joy at the chance to please her little
Thinking of this very thing, Dorothy dear, and often I have had it in my mind to propose it to you. I am sure your uncle and aunt must be good and worthy people, or you would not love them so much. And for your friends, Princess, there is always room in the land of Oz.
Dorothy was delighted, yet not altogether surprised, for she had clung to the hope that Ozma would be kind enough to grant her request. When indeed, had her powerful and faithful friend refused her anything.
But you must not call me Princess, for after this I shall live in the little farm with Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, and princesses ought not to live on farms. Princess Dorothy will not. You're going to live in your own rooms in this palace and be my constant companion. But Uncle Henry, oh, he is old and has worked enough in his lifetime. So we must find a place for your uncle and aunt where they will be comfortable and happy and need not work more than they care to. When shall we transport them here, Dorothy? Well, I promised to go and see them again before they were turned out of the farmhouse, so perhaps next Saturday. But why wait so long? And why make the journey back to Kansas again? Let us surprise them and bring them back without any warning. Oh, I'm not sure that they believe in the land of Oz, though I've told them about it lots of times. They'll believe it when they see it. And if they are told they are to make a magical journey to our fairyland, it may make them nervous. I think the best way will be to use the magic belt without warning them. And when they have arrived, you can explain to them whatever they do not understand. Well, perhaps that's best. There isn't much use in their staying at the farm until they're put out, because it's much nicer here. Then tomorrow morning they shall come here. I will order Jellica Jam, who is the palace housekeeper, to have rooms all prepared for them. And after breakfast we will get the magic belt, and by its aid transport your uncle and aunt to the Emerald City. Oh, thank you, Ozma. And now, let us take a walk in the gardens before we dress for dinner. Come, Dorothy dear.
For some time Ozma had ruled over this fair country, and never was ruler more popular or beloved. She is said to be the most beautiful girl the world has ever known, and her heart and mind are as lovely as her person. Dorothy Gale had several times visited the Emerald City and experienced adventures in the land of Oz, so that she and Ozma had become firm friends. The girl ruler had even made Dorothy a princess of Oz and had often implored her to come to Ozma's stately palace and live there always. But Dorothy had been loyal to her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, who had cared for her since she was a baby, and she had refused to leave them because she knew they would be lonely without her. However, Dorothy now realized that things were going to be different with her uncle and her aunt from this time forward. So after putting the matter in thought, she decided to ask Ozma to grant her one great favor. A few seconds after she had made the secret signal in her little bedchamber, the Kansas girl was seated in a lovely room in Ozma's palace in the Emerald City of Oz. When the first loving kisses and embraces had been exchanged, the fair ruler inquired,
What is the matter, dear? I know something unpleasant has happened to you, for your face was very sober when I saw it in my magic picture. And whenever you signal me to transport you to this safe place, where you are always welcome, I know you are in danger or in trouble. This time, Ozma, it isn't I, but it's worse, I guess, for Uncle Henry and Aunt Em are in a big heap of trouble, and there seems no way to get them out of it. Anyhow, not while they live in Kansas. Tell me about it, Dorothy. Why, you see, Uncle Henry is poor, for the farm in Kansas doesn't much as farms go. So one day Uncle Henry borrowed some money and wrote a letter saying that if he didn't pay the money back, they could take his farm and pay. Of course, he expected to pay by making money from the farm, but he just couldn't. And so they're going to take the farm, and Uncle Henry and Aunt Anne won't have any place to live. They're pretty old to do much hard work, Ozma, and I'll have to work for them unless...
Ozma has been thoughtful during the story, but now she smiled and pressed her little friend's hand.
Unless what, dear?
Dorothy hesitated because her request meant so much to them all.
Well, I'd like to live here in the land of Oz, where you've often invited me to live. But I can't, unless Uncle Henry and Aunt Anne could live here too. Of course not. So in order to get you, little friend, we must invite your uncle and aunt to live in Oz also. Oh, will you, Ozma? Oh, will you? Will you bring them here with the magic belt and give them a nice little farm in the Munchkin country or in Winkie country or some other place? To be sure.
Full of joy at the chance to please her little
Thinking of this very thing, Dorothy dear, and often I have had it in my mind to propose it to you. I am sure your uncle and aunt must be good and worthy people, or you would not love them so much. And for your friends, Princess, there is always room in the land of Oz.
Dorothy was delighted, yet not altogether surprised, for she had clung to the hope that Ozma would be kind enough to grant her request. When indeed, had her powerful and faithful friend refused her anything.
But you must not call me Princess, for after this I shall live in the little farm with Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, and princesses ought not to live on farms. Princess Dorothy will not. You're going to live in your own rooms in this palace and be my constant companion. But Uncle Henry, oh, he is old and has worked enough in his lifetime. So we must find a place for your uncle and aunt where they will be comfortable and happy and need not work more than they care to. When shall we transport them here, Dorothy? Well, I promised to go and see them again before they were turned out of the farmhouse, so perhaps next Saturday. But why wait so long? And why make the journey back to Kansas again? Let us surprise them and bring them back without any warning. Oh, I'm not sure that they believe in the land of Oz, though I've told them about it lots of times. They'll believe it when they see it. And if they are told they are to make a magical journey to our fairyland, it may make them nervous. I think the best way will be to use the magic belt without warning them. And when they have arrived, you can explain to them whatever they do not understand. Well, perhaps that's best. There isn't much use in their staying at the farm until they're put out, because it's much nicer here. Then tomorrow morning they shall come here. I will order Jellica Jam, who is the palace housekeeper, to have rooms all prepared for them. And after breakfast we will get the magic belt, and by its aid transport your uncle and aunt to the Emerald City. Oh, thank you, Ozma. And now, let us take a walk in the gardens before we dress for dinner. Come, Dorothy dear.
Chapter 4. How the Gnome King Planned Revenge. The reason most people are bad is because they do not try to be good. Now the Gnome King had never tried to be good, so he was very bad indeed. Having decided to conquer the land of Oz and to destroy the Emerald City and enslave all its people, King Roquat the Red kept planning ways to do this dreadful thing, and the more he planned, the more he believed he would be able to do it. About the time Dorothy went to Ozma, the Gnome King called his chief steward to him and said, "Calico, I think I shall make you the general of my armies." "I think you won't." "Why not?" reaching for his scepter with the big sapphire. "Because I'm your chief servant and know nothing about warfare." Preparing to dodge if anything were thrown at him, "I manage all the affairs of your kingdom better than you could yourself, and you'll never find another steward as good as I am. But there are 100 gnomes better fitted to command your army, and your generals get thrown away so often I have no desire to be one of them." Ah, there is some truth in your remarks, Calico, remarked the king, deciding not to throw the scepter. Summon my army to assemble in the great cavern. Calico bowed and retired, and in a few minutes returned to say that the army was assembled. So the king went out upon the balcony that overlooked the great cavern, where 50,000 gnomes, all armed with swords and pikes, stood marshaled in military array. Will someone answer that phone? When they were not required as soldiers, all these gnomes were metalworkers and miners, and had hammered so much at the forge and dug so hard with pick and shovel that they had acquired great muscular strength. They were strangely formed creatures, rather round and not very tall. Their toes were curly and their ears flat and broad. In time of war, every gnome left his forge or mine and became part of the great army of King Roquat. The soldiers wore rock-colored uniforms and were excellently drilled. The king looked upon this tremendous army, which stood silently arrayed before him, and a cruel smile curled the corners of his mouth, for he saw that his legions were very powerful. Then he addressed them from the balcony. I have thrown away King General Blug because he did not please me. So I want another general to command this army. Who is next in command? I am, replied Colonel Crinkle, a dapper-looking gnome, and he stepped forward to salute his monarch. The king looked at him carefully and said, I want you to march this army through an underground tunnel, which I am going to bore to the Emerald City of Oz. When you get there, I want you to conquer the Oz people, destroy them in their city, and bring all their gold and silver and precious stones back to my cavern. Also, you are to recapture my magic belt and return it to me. Will you do this, General Crinkle? No, your majesty, for it can't be done. Oh, indeed! Then he turned to his servants and said, Please take General Crinkle to the torture chamber. There you will kindly slice him into thin slices, and afterwards feed him to the 7-headed dogs. Anything to oblige your majesty, replied the servants politely, and led the condemned man away. When they had gone, the king addressed the army again. Listen! The general who is to command my armies must promise to carry out my orders. If he fails, he will share the fate of poor Crinkle. Now then, who will volunteer to lead my host to the Emerald City? For a time, no one moved, and all were silent. Then an old gnome with white whiskers so long that they were tied around his waist to prevent their tripping him up, stepped out of the ranks and saluted the king. I would like to ask a few questions, your majesty. Go ahead. These Oz people are quite good, are they? As good as apple pie. And they're happy, I suppose. Happy as the day is long. And contented and prosperous. Very much so. Well, your majesty, I think I would like to undertake the job. So I'll be your general. I hate good people. I detest happy people. I am opposed to anyone who is contented and prosperous. That is why I'm so fond of your majesty. Make me your general, and I promise to conquer and destroy the Oz people. If I fail, I'm ready to be sliced thin and fed to the 7-headed dogs. Very good indeed. That's the way to talk. What's your name, General? I'm called Gump, your majesty. Well, Gump, come with me to my private cave and we'll talk it over. Then he turned to the army. Gnomes and soldiers, you are to obey the commands of General Gump until he becomes dog-fed. Any man who fails to obey his new general will be promptly thrown away. You are now dismissed. Gump went to the king's private cave and sat down upon the amethyst chair and put his feet on the arm of the king's roby throne. Then he lighted his pipe and threw the live coal he had taken from his pocket upon the king's left foot, and puffed the smoke into the king's eyes and made himself comfortable. For he was a wise old gnome, and he knew that the best way to get along with Roquat the Red was to show that he was not afraid of him. I'm ready to talk, your majesty. The king coughed and looked at his new general fiercely. Do you not tremble to take such liberties with your monarch? Yeah, now. As he blew a wreath of smoke that curled around the king's nose and made him sneeze. You want to conquer the Emerald City, and I'm the only gnome in your dominion who can conquer it. So you will be careful not to hurt me until I have carried out your wishes. After that, what? What then? Then you'll be so grateful to me that you won't care to hurt me. That is a very good argument. But suppose you fail. Then it's the slicing machine. I agree to that. But if you do, as I tell you, there will be no failure. The trouble with you, Roquat, is that you don't think carefully enough. I do. You would go ahead and march through the tunnel into Oz and get defeated and driven back. I won't. The reason I won't is because when I march, I'll have all my plans made and a host of allies to assist my gnomes. What do you mean by that? I'll explain, King Roquat. You're going to attack a fairy country, and a mighty fairy country too. They haven't much of an army in Oz, but the princess who rules them has a fairy wand, and the little girl Dorothy has your magic belt. And at the north of the Emerald City lives a clever sorceress called Glinda the Good, who commands the spirits of the air. Also, I have heard that there is a wonderful wizard in Oma's palace who is so skillful that people used to pay him money in America to see him perform. So you see, it will be no easy thing to overcome all this magic. We have 50,000 soldiers. Yes, but they are gnomes, taking a silk handkerchief from the king's pocket and wiping his own pointed shoes with it. Gnomes are immortals, but they are not strong on magic. When you've lost your famous belt, the greater part of your own power was gone from you. Against Ozma, you and your gnomes would have no show at all. Roquat's eyes flashed angrily. Then away you go to the slicing machine. Not yet, said the general, filling his pipe from the king's private tobacco pouch. What do you propose to do? I propose to obtain the power we need. There are a good many evil creatures who have evil powers sufficient to destroy and conquer the land of Oz. We will get them on our side, band them all together, and then take Ozma and her people by surprise. It's all very simple and easy when you know how. Alone we should be helpless to injure the ruler of Oz, but with the aid of the evil powers we can summon, we shall easily succeed. King Roquat was delighted with this idea, for he realized how clever it was. Surely, Gumph, you are the greatest general I have ever had, his eyes sparkling with joy. You must go at once and make arrangement with the evil powers to assist us, and meanwhile I'll begin to dig the tunnel. I thought you'd agree with me, Roquat. I'll start this very afternoon to visit the chief of the Whimsies. Chapter 6. How Gumph Visited the Whimsies. The new general of the Gnome King's army knew perfectly well that to fail in his plans meant death for him. Yet he was not at all anxious or worried. He hated everyone who was good and longed to make all who were happy unhappy. Therefore, he had accepted this dangerous position as general quite willingly, feeling sure in his little evil mind that he would be able to do a lot of mischief and finally conquer the land of Oz. Yet Gumph determined to be careful and to lay his plans well so as not to fail. He argued that only careless people would fail in what they attempted to do. The mountain underneath which the Gnome King's extensive caverns were located lay grouped just north of the land of Ev, which lay directly across the deadly desert to the east of the land of Oz. As the mountains were also on the edge of the desert, the Gnome King found that he had only to tunnel underneath the desert to reach Ozma's dominions. He did not wish his armies to appear above ground in the country of the Winkies, which was the part of the land of Oz nearest to King Roquat's own country, as then the people would give alarm and enable Ozma to fortify the Emerald City and assemble an army. He wanted to take all the Oz people by surprise. So he decided to run the tunnel clear through to the Emerald City, where he and his host would break through the ground without warning and conquer the people before they had time to defend themselves. Roquat the Red began work at once upon his tunnel, setting 1,000 miners at the task and building it high and broad enough for his armies to march through with ease. The gnomes were used to making tunnels, as all the kingdom in which they lived was underground, so they made rapid progress. While this work was going on, General Gumpf started out alone to visit the chief of the Whimsies. These Whimsies were curious people who lived in a retired country of their own. They had large, strong bodies, but heads so small they were no bigger than doorknobs. Of course, such tiny heads could not contain any great amount of brains, and the Whimsies were so ashamed of their personal appearance and lack of common sense that they wore big heads made out of pasteboard, which they fastened over their own little heads. On these pasteboard heads they sewed sheep's wool for hair, and the wool was colored many tints, pink, green, and lavender being the favorite colors. The faces of these false heads were painted in many ridiculous ways, according to the whims of the owners, and these big burly creatures looked so whimsical and absurd in their queer masks that they were called the Whimsies. They had foolishly imagined that no one would suspect the little heads that were inside the imitation ones, not knowing that it is folly to try to appear otherwise than as nature has made us. The chief of the Whimsies has as little wisdom as the others, and had been chosen chief merely because none among them was any wiser or more capable of ruling. The Whimsies were evil spirits and could not be killed. They were hated and feared by everyone and were known as terrible fighters because they were so strong and muscular and had not sense enough to know when they were defeated. General Gumpf thought the Whimsies would be a great help to the gnomes in the conquest of Oz, for under his leadership they could be induced to fight as long as they could stand up. So he traveled to their country and asked to see the chief, who lived in a house that had a picture of his grotesque false head painted over the doorway. The chief's false head had blue hair, a turned-up nose, and a mouth that stretched half across the face. Big green eyes had been painted upon it, but in the center of the chin were 2 small holes made in the pasteboard, so that the chief could see through them with his own tiny eyes. For when the big head was fastened upon his shoulders, the eyes of his own natural head were at the level of the false chin. Said General Gumpf to the chief of the Whimsies, "We gnomes are going to conquer the land of Oz and capture our king's magic belt, which the Oz people stole from him. Then we are going to plunder and destroy the whole country, and we want the Whimsies to help us. Will there be any fighting?" "Plenty." That must have pleased the chief, for he got up and danced around the room 3 times. Then he seated himself again, adjusted his false head, and said, "We have no quarrel with the Ozma of Oz. But you Whimsies love to fight, and here is a splendid chance to do so. Wait till I sing the songs." Then he lay back in his chair and sang a foolish song that did not seem to the general to mean anything, although he listened carefully. When he had finished, the chief Whimsy looked at him through the holes in his chin and asked, "What reward will you give us if we help you?" The general was prepared for this question, for he had been thinking the matter over on his journey. People often do a good deed without hope of reward, but an evil deed they always demand payment. "When we get our magic belt, our king Roquat the Red will use its power to give every Whimsy a natural head as big and fine as the false head he now wears. Then you will no longer be ashamed because your big strong bodies have such teeny-weeny heads." "Ooh, would you do that?" "We surely would." "Ooh, I'll talk to my people." So he called a meeting of all the Whimsies and told them of the offer made by the gnomes. The creatures were delighted with the bargain and at once agreed to fight for the King Gnome and to help him conquer Oz. One Whimsy alone seemed to have a glimmer of sense. "Suppose we capture the magic belt, what will happen then, and what good will all our fighting do?" But they only threw him in the river for asking foolish questions and laughed when the water ruined his pasteboard head before he could swim out again. So the compact was made, and General Gumpf was delighted with his success in gaining such powerful allies. There were other people, too, just as important as the Whimsies, whom the clever old gnome had determined to win to his side.